Hello, this is Thaddeus Kaczynski, um, and this will be a commentary on some of the readings and themes and ideas in week 14, which is a treatment of the huge debate regarding the natural desire for the beatific vision, natural desire for God, which was prompted in earnest after the publication in 1946 of Surnaturel by Henri de Lubac. There's quite a bit of material on this debate, dissertations and books and whole journal articles devoted to it. I put some links on the Populi to some articles from the Summa, as well as some secondary sources on this debate. We're just about finished with our course. This will be our last sort of, new content. Next week we'll have a discussion on just the course in general, what we talked about and what we learned between myself and Professor Washut. So be on the lookout for that next week. But there's quite a bit of material for you to think about in this week. There's a discussion question. There's also an assignment. You're also working on. You will be working on your final paper. So since there's so much material already, I'm going to keep this commentary short. And I could not possibly do this debate justice in even an hour's worth of commentary. So perhaps we'll just look at some of the basic ideas of the debate, the basic, perhaps, the crux of it, and then we could look at some of St. Thomas's articles on the question that I put up on Populi. Well, what is the nature of this debate? Well, it has to do with the relationship of nature, human nature, and grace. And there's this, with de Lubac saw a problem with the scholasticism of the 15th, 16th centuries, identifying a problem with Cajetan, the great commentator in St. Thomas. What de Lubac saw as a problem is the idea of there being a certain kind of purely extrinsic relationship of nature and grace, with nature having this human nature without grace, having a kind of autonomy to itself, an integrity, by which man would have a natural end of natural happiness and a natural knowledge of God, where his supernatural end and his supernatural knowledge and love of God through grace would be sort of superadded to that pure nature. This posed many problems, according to de Lubac. This nature-grace extrinsicism. Grace becomes a mere add-on to a kind of self-sufficient, independent idea of human nature. And this has the tendency to eclipse the priority of grace and even make it unnecessary or at least irrelevant, and maybe having no intrinsic relationship to our natural knowledge and natural loves. So in contrast to this, de Lubac thinks this is a misreading of St. Thomas, and the more accurate reading is that, paradoxically, we do not have an independent, autonomous, self-sufficient human nature. We were not made that way. You could think about a hypothetical human nature that could have been made by God without grace, without even the possibility of grace. I mean, just a pure human nature, which would be satisfied with purely natural, rational goods, such as a kind of philosophical knowledge of God from his effects, knowing God as a principle of his effects, which is the knowledge of God we get in Aristotle, for instance, and attaining to a kind of natural happiness, the kind of happiness you see in Dante. This, in the first level of hell, actually, it's a sort of, natural happiness that, doesn't isn't capable of anything higher, but it's also, satisfying to a nature created for natural happiness. But Lubac thinks that this is, purely hypothetical. In fact, we do not have a natural end. We have a supernatural end. Human beings are created with a nature that is itself, you might say, supernaturalized. The end of human nature is a supernatural end, and there's only one end of human nature. We are created already, always already, within the environment, within the ambit of grace. So we are created with a graced nature. Of course, it's fallen, but our nature now, as it was before the fall and now is still, is one intrinsically ordered to grace from the beginning. It is not an extrinsic add-on to a kind of self-sufficient pure nature. So de Lubac wrote, Surnaturel, which got him into trouble with the Vatican, actually. He was eventually vindicated, and many say that his understanding of nature and grace and his ressourcement, nouveau theology approach to the tradition, the focus on patristics and scripture, and not a kind of manual Neo-Thomism, which was criticized by de Lubac, von Balthasar, and the like. So many say that de Lubac was a kind of, architect for Vatican II. He was vindicated and updated his work with the mystery of the supernatural he wrote, as well as, I think, Augustinianism in Modern Theology. That's the title. Now, the response to de Lubac and Nouveau Theologie has been critical by neo-Thomists such as Stephen Long, Reinhard Hutter, writing in Nova et Vetera and the Thomist, and they would say that de Lubac, in his attempt to ensure the priority and intrinsic, organic, you might say, understanding of grace and its relation to nature, in a sense, did away with human nature itself. So we have a kind of supernaturalism where grace is so built into human nature that you might even ask, how is it even gratuitous? In other words, grace is a gift. It is not a demand of human nature. If it were, we'd have a problem with free will and, God's freedom to have created us without the possibility of grace. Grace is a gift that our nature doesn't deserve. It doesn't merit. Then the question becomes, well, if grace is gratuitous and a gift from without, you might say, if it's not built into our nature, then we might have the danger then of putting too much emphasis on nature's autonomy, self-sufficiency, integrity without grace. So the two poles of the debate, you can see nature, grace, extrinsicism, criticized by de Lubac and others, von Balthasar, where grace becomes a mere add-on to a self-sufficient, independent, integral nature. And the other extreme would be that nature and grace distinction is not kept as distinct as it should be. Nature itself becomes kind of a supernaturalized nature, and grace loses its gratuitous, gift-like reality. Okay, we'll move into some of St. Thomas's articles in the next section of commentary.